Thanks, everyone, for being here today. Mr. Lettieri, I'll just start and maybe follow up on some of the themes of what you started out with this economic dynamism fading, essentially. And, you know, it's interesting because company startups, as you mentioned, have been on the decline. If you go back to 1977, contributing 16% of total U.S. employment. And I think you mentioned the 8% figure that we have now dropping down to 2013 for that type of startup. So it's small business, engine of the economy. We always like to talk about how most of our jobs or economic growth comes from that sector. But the two time periods where those company startups rebounded or actually increased in this large 40-year period were during the mid-'80s, where it jumped up from 11.8% to 13%, and also in the early 2000s when it jumped up from 9.7% to 10.8%. So we had a jump up, and it's that chain reaction, I think, that was mentioned earlier that leads to other economic churn and opportunity and growth. What was it about those two time periods, either related to public policy or technology or some of the changes that we should be looking forward right now in terms of replicating or reproducing in some manner? Anything in those two time frames in particular that stand out?
Well, we had major tax policy changes preceding both of those periods. I would just caution that I don't know that that's a perfect explanation for what followed, because I think one of the points that we can't underscore enough is that demographics play a huge role in rates of entrepreneurship, and that's both nationally and regionally. So and I haven't looked at those demographic changes during those time periods, but may have also been providing tailwinds for those types of bumps. I'll just point out now that there's, and actually I think your legislation on employee stock ownership is a great example of things that are not intentional barriers to entrepreneurship or to the health of new companies, but are just in the background providing an advantage to larger incumbents and a disadvantage in the competition for talent among smaller private firms, which is particularly true for new firms. So there are things like that we can do that on their own may not seem like massive changes in policy, but in the aggregate will have a tremendous and I think eventually transformative effect on leveling the playing field back towards competition and new entry.
Sure. And you referenced the bipartisan legislation for helping those that may have stock options but don't have a market to sell those options in. But it's both in the Senate and the House, and we may be able to move that forward to promote new startups. Let me follow up, too, because you had 5 recommendations, one of which was enhancing geographic mobility. Are there any policy initiatives that any of you might have about enhancing geographic mobility? Obviously, immigration is one component. And anything else?
Yes, and this is about not doing something that we're doing now, which is this Kafka-esque patchwork of occupational licensing barriers around the country. This is mostly a state and local issue, but I think if I would urge you to do anything, it's to use the bully pulpit that you have in Congress to really point out and spotlight just how poisonous this is for the economy. It really checks all the wrong boxes. It hurts people who are least advantaged the most. It inhibits geographic mobility, meaning that you can't transfer your skills. Even if you are highly licensed and highly skilled and highly trained, you can't transfer those from one state to another in most cases without having to go through that whole process again. So it's a tax on folks just moving to higher opportunities, locations with higher opportunity. And they create these bizarre and non-conforming standards that have proven over and over again in research to not bring any benefit to the consumer and to actually depress jobs. I mean, Alan Kruger, former advisor to President Obama, has done great research on this that shows to the tune of millions of jobs and hundreds of billions of dollars of cost that these regulations play. So this is in an era of low dynamism, this is exactly the kind of thing we have to carve out of the system. And it's in every state, and just with one more point, we've only had 8 successful instances of delicensing a occupation in a state, 8. And now 30% of U.S. jobs.
Just to be bipartisan, I want to be clear that I very much endorse those comments about occupational licensing. Another piece of this that I think would be helpful, one of the real constraints, and we know this, is housing costs. Especially going from rural areas where housing can be extremely cheap relative to other areas. And so one of the problems we have with our housing vouchers program is they're not generous enough to help people move across areas where housing costs rise considerably. And a lot of those areas are areas with considerably more opportunity. And there are ways in which the program itself is constrained such that the voucher amount is set in too small a geographical space. So if we simply open up that space, that will improve the ability of people to move to opportunity through the voucher program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.